Daddy welcome to Heavy D Storytelling. We are going to be reading the Bible. Then
Wow.
we are going to be doing the synopsis with Kimberly. Then we are going to be reading The Princess Bride. I hope you guys enjoy. Make sure to hit the like button, subscribe, and hit the bell to never miss another video. I'd like you guys to know if you like it more if I talk slowly or if I talk fast.
Slow.
I like fast.
All right, come on.
Come on, we got a lot to do tonight.
Just joking.
All right.
Hi there, one person.
You're welcome.
Thank you for joining me. We have Esther chapter 7. We're reading from the English Standard Version of the Old Testament. And this is my last night with this because I have to work tomorrow at the office. Oh no! Oh my goodness! I was just going to wait and see if anybody else was going to join. I know Granny Bear caught up yesterday, so she might join. I'm going to go ahead and start. All right, so this is Esther chapter 7. So the king and Haman went in to feast with Queen Esther, and on the second day, as they were drinking wine after the feast, the king again said to Esther, "What is your wish, Queen Esther? It shall be granted you. And what is your request? Even to half of my kingdom it shall be fulfilled." Then Queen Esther answered, "If I have found favor in your sight, O king, and if it please the king, let my life be granted me for my wish, and my people for my request. For we have been sold, I and my people, to be destroyed, to be killed, and to be annihilated. If we have been sold merely as slaves, men and women, I would have been silent, for our affliction is not to be compared with the loss to the king." Then King Ahasuerus said to Queen Esther, "Who is he, and where is he who dared to do this?" And Esther said, "A foe and enemy, the wicked Haman." Then Haman was terrified before the king and the queen. And the king arose in his wrath from the wine drinking and went into the palace garden. But Haman stayed to beg for his life from Queen Esther, for he saw that harm was determined against him by the king. And the king returned from the palace garden to the place where they were drinking wine, as Haman was falling on the couch where Esther was. And the king said, "Will he even assault the queen in my presence, in my own house?" As the word left the mouth of the king, they covered Haman's face. Then Harbona, one of the eunuchs in attendance of the king, said, "Moreover, the gallows that Haman has prepared for Mordecai, whose word saved the king, is standing at Haman's house 50 cubits high." That's really tall, by the way. And the king said, "Hang him on that." So they hanged Haman on the gallows that he had prepared for Mordecai. Then the wrath of the king abated. By the way, 50 cubits is probably about between 70 and 80 feet. And I'll cancel that in a minute. And so we went on a trip a couple of weeks ago, not the family, but it was me with a bunch of men from the church. And there was a cross that is set up in this town in Texas. It's Kerrville is the name of the town in Texas. It's northwest of San Antonio, and the cross is 77.7 feet tall. Okay, so that is approximately 50 cubits. I'm telling you right now, that was a pretty tall cross. This is a pretty tall gallows that they had prepared for Mordecai, but that was actually used on Haman. So, the end of Haman, the beginning of the rest of the book, which we will read chapter 8 tomorrow. And now I'm going to grant Kimberly the wonderful experience of being able to present the synopsis in a very concise format tonight.
Amazing.
So, in the last chapter, hi, Becca! In the last chapter, what happened was Buttercup realized that the man in black was Wesley, so she jumped down this ravine that she had pushed him down, and then later Wesley realized that the ravine, it was heading toward the fire swamp. Woo! So, the guy, Prince Humperdinck, he was like, "Hello, Mom!" What happened was, he was like, this guy, he went down into that ravine probably to try to buy time because he knew that we were after him, and I bet that he didn't know that the fire swamp was at the end of that ravine, and he was right for a little while. And they go through the fire swamp. Buttercup nearly drowns in snow sand. That's what it's called. And then Wesley gets attacked by it was rodents of unusual size.
But we don't know that yet.
No.
Yeah, we do.
They said.
We said it.
And then what happens was they go through the rest of the swamp, and then Prince Humperdinck and all of his armies and stuff were waiting for him at the other side. So, and I'm honestly really sure that, Buttercup, she said that she went with Prince Humperdinck, and she told Wesley that she could live without love. But I don't think so. What I think what really was happening was she knew that if she stood with Wesley, I can't say the name right now, Wesley, if she stood with Wesley, then they would just kill Wesley and force her to marry Prince Humperdinck anyway. So, she's turning herself in so that Wesley lives, 'cause she loves Wesley, and this way he stays alive and she stays alive. So she's really protecting him. Just my opinion.
I love that. What was that?
Humperdinck! Humperdinck! Alright, so, now we are going to begin Chapter 6, the festivities. I just looked at it. This is a 60-page chapter. So, we will not be, We will not be getting through 60 pages today. We will not. But I want to try to get through half of it, which is going to make just as long of a video as the last ones have been. My goal, I just looked at the rest of the book. There are 3 chapters left, 6, 7, and 8. I think we can do 6 in one day. We can do most of 7 in one day, and then we'll finish 6 in 2 days. Most of 7 in one day, and then we'll finish 7 and read chapter 8, which is relatively short. We'll do that in one day, so we have 4 more sessions. Today, the next day, the next day, and the next day. Or we might skip Wednesday because no, we probably will skip Wednesday.
So you're doing this on Friday?
We'll probably skip Friday too. So anyway, whatever combination of that is, we'll have 4 more reading sessions for this book. So Without further ado, this is Chapter 6, The Festivities, and it begins with a italicized side note from the abridger, Mr. William Goldman, the abridgment of this book by S. Morgenstern. This is one of those chapters, again, where Professor Bongiorno of Columbia, the Florinese guru, claims that Morgenstern's satiric genius is at its fullest flower. That's the way this guy talks. Fullest flower. Delicious drolleries, on and on. Gotta fix this. JJ really liked the way the pillows were, and then they've gotten messed up. Yay! On and on. The festivities chapter is mostly detailed descriptions of, guess what? Bingo. The festivities. It's like 89 days till the nuptials, and every high muckamuck in Florin has to give a due for the couple, and what Morgenstern fills his pages with is how the various riches of the time entertained. The richies of the time entertained. What kind of parties, what kind of food, who did the decorations, how did the seating arrangements get settled, all that kind of thing. The only interesting part, but it's not worth going through 44 pages is that Prince Humperdinck gets more and more interested and mannerly toward Buttercup, cutting down even a little on his hunting activities, and more important, because of the foiling of the kidnapping attempt, 3 things happen. Number 1, everyone is pretty well convinced that the plot was engineered by Gilder, so relations between the countries are more than a little strained. Number 2, Buttercup is just adored by everybody because the rumors are all over that she acted very brave and even came through the fire swamp alive. And, number 3, Prince Humperdinck is, at last, in his own land, a hero. He was never popular, what with his hunting fetish and leaving the country to kind of rot once his old man got senile, but the way he foiled the kidnapping made everybody realize that this was some brave fella, and they were lucky to have him next in line to lead them. Anyhow, these 44 pages covered just about the first month of party giving, and it's not till the end of that for my money, things get going again. Buttercup is in bed, pooped, it's late, the end of another long party, and as she waits for sleep, she wonders what sea Wesley is riding on, and the giant and the Spaniard, whatever happened to them. So eventually, in 3 quick flashbacks, Morgenstern returns to what I think is the story. When Inigo regained consciousness, it was still night on the cliffs of insanity, far below the waters of Florin Channel pounded. Inigo stirred, blinked, tried to rub his eyes, couldn't. His arms were tied together around a tree. Inigo blinked again, banishing cobwebs. He had gone on his knees to the man in black, ready for death. Clearly, the victor had other notions. Inigo looked around as best he could, and there it was, the 6-fingered sword glittering in the moonlight like lost magic. Inigo stretched his right leg as far as it would go and managed to touch the handle. Then it was simply a matter of inching the weapon close enough to be graspable by one hand, and then it was an even simpler task to slash his bindings. He was dizzy when he stood, and he rubbed his head behind his ear, where the man in black had struck him. A lump, sizable to be sure, but not a major problem. The major problem was what to do now. Vizzini had strict instructions for occasions such as this. When a plan went wrong, go back to the beginning, and wait for Vizzini, then regroup, replan, start again. Inigo had even made a little rhyme out of it for Fezzik, so the giant would not have a problem remembering what to do in time of trouble. Fool, fool, go back to the beginning is the rule. Inigo knew precisely where the beginning was. They had gotten the job in Florin City itself, the thieves' quarter. Vizzini had made the arrangements alone, as he always did. He had met with their employer and had accepted the job, had planned it all in the thieves' quarter, so the thieves' quarter was clearly the place to go. Only Inigo hated it there. Everybody was so dangerous, big, mean, and muscular. And so what if he was the greatest fencer in the world? Who'd know to look at him? He looked like a skinny Spanish guy it might be fun to rob. You couldn't walk around with a sign saying, "Be careful, this is the greatest fencer since the death of the wizard of Corsica." Do not burgle. Besides, and here Inigo felt deep pain, he wasn't the great fencer, not any more. He couldn't be. Hadn't he just been beaten? Once, true, he had been a Titan, but not now. And some more interruption here. What happens here that you aren't going to read is the 6-page soliloquy from Inigo, in which Morgenstern, through Inigo, reflects on the anguish of fleeting glory. The reason for the soliloquy here is that Morgenstern's previous book had gotten bombed by the critics, and also hadn't sold beans. Aside, did you know that Robert Browning's first book of poems didn't sell one copy? True. Even his mother didn't buy it at her local bookstore. Have you ever heard anything more humiliating? How would you like to have been Browning, and it's your first book, and you have these secret hopes that now you'll be somebody, established, important, and you give it a week before you ask the publisher how things are going because you don't want to seem pushy or anything, and then maybe you drop by, and it was probably all very English and understated in those days, but you're Browning, and you chit-chat around a bit before you drop the biggie. Oh, and, by the way, any notions how my poems might be doing? And then this editor, who's been dreading this moment, probably says, well, you know how it is with poetry these days. Nothing's taken off like it used to. Requires a bit of time for the word to get around. And then finally somebody had to say it. None, Bob. Sorry, Bob. No, we haven't sold one authenticated sale. We haven't yet had one authenticated sale. We thought for a bit that Hatch Cards had potential buyer down in Piccadilly, but it didn't quite work out. Sorry, Bob. Of course, we'll keep you posted in the event of a breakthrough. End of aside. Anyway, Inigo finishes his speech to the cliffs and spends the next few hours finding a fisherman who sails him back to Florence City. Fortunately, during Inigo's soliloquy, the prince didn't show up because the prince might have killed him. I don't know.
He probably would have.
Yeah, I don't know. Anyway, the thieves' quarter was worse than he remembered, always before Fezzik had been with him, and they made rhymes, and Fezzik was enough to keep any thief away. Inigo moved, panicked, up the dark streets, desperately afraid. Why this giant fear? What was he afraid of? He sat on a filthy stoop and pondered. Around him there were cries in the night, and from the alehouses vulgar laughter. He was afraid, he realized then, because as he sat there, gripping the 6-fingered sword for confidence, he was suddenly back to what he had been before Vicini had found him. A failure. A man without point, with no attachment to tomorrow. Inigo had not touched brandy in years. Now he felt his fingers fumbling for money. Now he heard his footsteps running toward the nearest alehouse. Now he saw his money on the counter. Now he felt the brandy bottle in his hands. Back to the stoop he ran. He opened the bottle. He smelled the rough brandy. He took a sip. He coughed. He took a swallow. He coughed again. He gulped it down and coughed and gulped some more and half began to smile. His fears were starting to leave him. After all, why should he have even been afraid? He was Inigo Montoya. The bottle was half gone now. Son of the great Domingo Montoya. So what was there in the world worth fearing? Now all the brandy was gone. How dare fear approach a wizard How dare fear approach a wizard such as Inigo Montoya? Well, never again. Into the second bottle. Never, 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 never again. He sat alone and confident and strong. His life was straight and fine. He had money enough for brandy, and if you had that, you had the world. The stoop was wretched and bleak. Inigo slumped there, quite contented, clutching the bottle in his once trembling hands. Existence was really very simple when you did what you were told, and nothing could be simpler or better than what he had in store. All he had to do was wait and drink until Vicini came. Fezzik had no idea how long he was unconscious. He only knew as he staggered to his feet on the mountain path that his throat was very sore where the man in black had strangled him. What to do? The plans had all gone wrong. Fezzik closed his eyes, trying to think. There was a proper place to go when plans went wrong, but he couldn't quite remember it. Inigo had even made a rhyme up for him so he wouldn't forget, and now, even with that, he was so stupid he had forgotten what Was that it? Was it stupid, go and wait for Vizzini with Cupid? That rhymed, but where was the Cupid? Dummy, go out now and fill your tummy? That rhymed too, but what kind of instructions were those? What to do? Dunce, use your brains and do it right for once. No help. Nothing was any help. He never had done anything right, not in his whole life until Vizzini came, and without another thought Fezzik ran off into the night after the Sicilian. Vizzini was napping when he got there. He had been drinking wine and dozed off. Fezzik dropped to his knees and put his hands in prayer position. Vizzini, I'm sorry, he began. Vizzini napped on. Fezzik shook him gently. Vizzini did not wake. Not so gently this time. Nothing. Oh, I see. You're dead, Fezzik said. He stood up, sorry. He's dead, Vizzini is, he said softly. And then, with not a bit of help from his brain, a great scream of panic burst from his throat into the night. Inigo! And he whirled back down the mountain path, because if Inigo was alive, it would be all right. It wouldn't be the same. No, it couldn't be. It could never be that without Vizzini to order them and insult them as only he could, but at least there would be time for poetry, and when Fezzik reached the cliffs of insanity, he said, Inigo, here I am, to the rocks, and I'm here, Inigo, it's your Fezzik, to the trees, and Inigo, answer me, please, all over, until there was no other conclusion to draw, but there just as there was no Vizzini, there was also no Inigo, and that was hard. It was, in point of fact, too hard for Fezzik. So he began to run, crying out, Be with you in a minute, Inigo, and right behind you, Inigo, and hey, Inigo, wait up, straight up, which was the way he ran, and wouldn't there be fun with rhymes once he and Inigo were together again. But after an hour or so of shouting, his throat gave out because he had, after all, been strangled almost to death in the very recent past. On he ran, on and on and on, until finally he reached a tiny village and found, just outside the town, some nice rocks that formed kind of a cave, almost big enough for him to stretch out in. He sat with his back against a rock and his hands around his knees, and his throat hurting until the village boys found him. They held their breath and crept as close as they dared. Fezzik hoped they would go away, so he froze, pretending to be off with Inigo, and Inigo would say barrel, and Fezzik, right quick, would come back carol, and maybe they would sing a little something until Inigo said serenade, and you couldn't stump Fezzik with one that easy because of centigrade. And then Inigo would make a word about the weather, and Fezzik would rhyme it, and that was how it went until the village boys stopped being afraid of him. Fezzik could tell that because they were creeping very close to him now, and all of a sudden yelling their lungs out and making crazy faces. He didn't really blame them. He looked like the kind of person you did that to, mocked. His clothes were torn, and his throat was gone, and his eyes were wild, and he probably would have yelled too if he had been their age. It was only when they found him funny that he found it. It was only when they found him funny that he found it, though he did not know the word degrading. No more yelling, just laughter now. Laughter, Fezzik thought, and then he thought gerafter, because that's all he was to them. Some huge funny thing that couldn't make much noise. Laughter, gerafter, from now on to hereafter. Fezzik huddled up in his cave and tried looking on the bright side. At least they weren't throwing things at him. Not yet, anyway. Wesley awoke, chained in a giant cage. His shoulder was beginning to fester from the gnawing and digging that the ROUSs had done into his flesh. He ignored the discomfort momentarily to try and adjust to his surroundings. He was certainly underground. It was not the lack of windows that made that sure, more than dankness. From somewhere above him now he could hear animal sounds, an occasional lion roar, the yelp of a cheetah. Shortly after his return to consciousness, the albino appeared bloodless, with skin as pale as dying birch. The candlelight that served to illuminate the cage made the albino seem totally like a creature who had never seen the sun. The albino held a tray which carried many things, bandages and food, healing powders, and brandy. "Where are we?" from Wesley. A shrug from the albino. "Who are you?" Shrug. That was almost the entire extent of the fellow's conversation. Wesley asked question after question while the albino tended and redressed his wound, then fed him food that was warm and surprisingly good and plentiful. Shrug. Shrug. "Who knows I'm here?" Shrug. "Lie, but tell me something. Give me an answer. Who knows I'm here?" Whispered. "I know. They know." "They?" Shrug. "The prince and the count, you mean?" Nod. "And that is all?" Nod. "When I was brought in, I was half conscious. The count was giving the orders, but 3 soldiers were carrying me. They know, too." Shake. Whispered. "Knew." "They're dead, that's what you're saying." Shrug. "Am I to die too, then?" Shrug. Wesley lay back on the floor of the giant underground cage, watching as the albino silently reloaded the tray, glided from sight. If the soldiers were dead, surely it was not unreasonable to assume that he would eventually follow. But if they wanted his erasure, surely it was also not unreasonable to assume that they had not the least intention of doing it immediately. Else why tend his wounds? Why return his strength with good, warm food? No, his death would be a while yet. But in the meantime, considering the personalities of his captors, it was finally not unreasonable to assume that they would do their best to make him suffer greatly. Wesley closed his eyes. There was pain coming, and he had to be ready for it. He had to prepare his brain. He had to get his mind controlled and safe from their efforts, so that they could not break him. He would not let them break him. He would hold together against anything and all, if only they gave him sufficient time to make ready. He knew he could defeat pain. It turned out they gave him sufficient time. It was months before the machine was ready, but they broke him anyway. At the end of the 30th day of festivities, with 66 more of partying to enjoy, Buttercup was genuinely concerned that she might lack the strength to endure. Smile, smile, hold hands, bow, and thank you over and over. She was simply exhausted from 1 month. How was she to survive twice that? It turned out, because of the king's health, to be both easy and sad. For with 55 days to go, Lothoran began to weaken terribly. Prince Humperdinck ordered new doctors brought in. There was still the last miracle man alive, Max, but since they had fired him long before, bringing him back on the case now was simply not deemed wise. If he was competent then, when Lothoran was only desperately ill, how could he suddenly be a cure-all now, with Lothoran dying? The new doctors all agreed on various tried-and-true medications, and within 48 hours of their coming on the case, the king was dead. The wedding date, of course, was unchanged. It wasn't every day a country had a 500th anniversary, but all the festivities were either curtailed entirely or vastly cut down, and Prince Humperdinck became 45 before the wedding, King of Florin, and that changed everything, because before he had taken nothing but his hunting seriously, and now he had to learn everything, learn to run a country, and he buried himself in books and wise men, and how did you tax this, and when should you tax that, and foreign entanglements, and who could be trusted, and how far, and with what, and before her lovely eyes Humperdinck changed from a man of fear and action to one of frenzied wisdom, because he had to get it all straight now, before any other country dared interfere with the future of Florin. So the wedding, when it actually took place, was a tiny thing and brief, sandwiched in between a ministers' meeting and a treasury crisis, and Buttercup spent her first afternoon as queen, wandering around the castle, not knowing what in the world to do with herself. It wasn't until King Humperdinck walked out on the balcony with her to greet the gigantic throng that had spent the day in patient waiting that she realized it had happened. She was the queen. Her life, for whatever it was worth, belonged now to the people. They stood together on the castle balcony, accepting the cheers, the cries, the endless, thunderous hip-hips, until Buttercup said, "Please, may I walk once more among them?" And the king said with a nod that she might, and down she went again, as on the day of the wedding announcement, radiant and alone. And again the people swept apart to let her pass, weeping and cheering and bowing, and then one person booed. On the balcony, watching it all, Humperdinck reacted instantly, gesturing soldiers into the area where the sound had come from, dispatching more troops quickly down to surround the queen, and like clockwork, Buttercup was safe, the booer apprehended and led away. Wow, that's more interesting in the movie. "Hold a moment," Buttercup said, still shaken by the unexpectedness of what had happened. The soldier who held the booer stopped. "Bring her to me," Buttercup said. In a moment the booer was right there, eye to eye. It was an ancient woman, withered and bent, and Buttercup thought of all the faces that had gone by in her lifetime, but this one she could not remember. "Have we met?" the queen asked. The old one shook her head. "Then why on this day do you insult the queen?" "Because you are not worthy of cheers," the old woman said, and suddenly she was yelling. "You had love in your hands, and you gave it up for gold." She turned to the crowd. "It is true what I tell you. There was love alongside her in the fire swamp, and she dropped it in her fingers like garbage, and that is what she is, the queen of garbage." "I had given my word to the prince," Buttercup began, but the old woman would not be quieted. "Ask her how she got through the fire swamp. Ask her if she did it alone. She threw love away to be the queen of grime, the queen of muck. I am old and life means nothing to me, so I am the only person in all this crowd who dare to tell truth. And truth says how to the queen of feculence, if you want to." Oh, bow. Oh, that's a B. Sorry, it's in italics, so it looks like an H. Says, "Bow to the queen of feculence if you want to, but not I. Cheer the queen of slime and ordure if you want to, but not I. Rave over the beauty of the queen of cesspools, but not I. She was advancing on Buttercup now. "Take her away," Buttercup ordered, but the soldiers could not stop her, and the old woman kept coming on, her voice getting louder and louder and louder and louder and louder and louder. And Buttercup woke up screaming. She was in her bed, alone, safe. The wedding was still 60 days away, but her nightmares had begun. The next night she dreamed of giving birth to their first child and interruption. And hey, how about giving old Morgenstern credit for a major league fake out there? I mean, didn't you think for a while at least that they really were married? I did. No, we didn't, not this time through, but maybe in the 80s when I watched it for the first time. Probably so. It's one of my biggest memories of my father reading. I had pneumonia, remember, but I was a little better now, and madly caught up in this book. And the one thing you know when you're 10 is that no matter what, there's going to be a happy ending. They can sweat all they want to scare you, the authors, but back of it all, you know, you just have no doubt that in the long run, justice is going to win out. And Wesley and Buttercup, well, they had their troubles, sure, but they were going to get married and live happily ever after. I would bet the family fortune if I had found a sucker big enough to take me on. Well, when my father got through with that sentence where the wedding was sandwiched between ministers' meeting and the treasury, whatever, I said, "You read that wrong. My father's this little bald barber. Remember that too?" And kind of illiterate. Well, you just don't challenge a guy who has trouble reading and he's read something incorrectly, because that's really threatening. "I'm doing the reading," he said. "I know that, but you got it wrong. She didn't marry that rotten Humperdinck. She marries Wesley." "It says it right here," my father began, a little huffy, and he started going over it again. You must have skipped a page then, something. Get it right, huh? But now he was more than a bit upset. I skipped nothing. I read the words. The words are there. I read them. Good night, and off he went. Hey, please, no, I called after him. But he's stubborn, and next thing my mother was saying, your father says his throat is too sore. I told him not to read so much, and she tucked and fluffed me, and no matter how I battled, it was over. I want to know what fluffing me is. No more story till the next day. Probably like throwing the blanket over you or something. I spent that whole night thinking Buttercup married Humperdinck. It just rocked me. How can I explain it? But the world didn't work that way. Good got attracted to good. Evil, you flushed down the John, and that was that. But their marriage, I couldn't make it jibe. I did work at it. First, I thought that probably Buttercup had this fantastic effect on Humperdinck and turned him into kind of Wesley, or maybe Wesley and Humperdinck turned out to be long-lost brothers, and Humperdinck was so happy to get his brother back, he said, look, Wesley, I didn't realize who you were when I married her, so what I'll do is I'll divorce her and you marry her, and that way we'll all be happy. To this day, I don't think I was ever more creative. But it didn't take. Something was wrong, and I couldn't lose it. Suddenly, there was this discontent gnawing away until it had a place big enough to settle in, and then it curled up and stayed there, and it's still inside me, lurking as I write this now. The next night, when my father went back to reading, and the marriage turned out to have been Buttercup's dream, I screamed, I knew it! All along I knew it! And my father said, so, you're happy now? It's all right now. Can we please continue? And I said, go, and he did. But I wasn't happy. Oh, my ears were happy. I guess my story sense was happy, my heart too, but in my, I suppose you have to call it soul, there was that discontent shaking its dark head. And this was never explained to me till I was in my teens, and there was this great woman who lived in my hometown, Edith Neisser, dead now, and she wrote terrific books about how we screw up our children. Brothers and Sisters was one of her books, and Eldest Child was another, published by Harper. Edith doesn't need the plug, seeing, like I said, as she's no longer with us. But if there are any amongst you who are worried that maybe you're not being perfect parents, pick up one of Edith's book while there's still time. I knew her, 'cause her kid Ed got her haircuts from my pop, and she was this writer, and by my teens I knew secretly that was the life for me, too. Except I couldn't tell anybody. It was too embarrassing. Barber's sons, if they hustled, maybe I got to be IBM salesman, but writers? No way. Don't ask me how, but eventually Edith discovered my ambition, and from then on sometimes we would talk. And I remember once we were having iced tea on the Neisser porch and talking, and just outside the porch was their badminton court, and I was watching some kids play badminton, and Ed had just shellacked me. And as I left the court for the porch, he said, "Don't worry, it'll all work out. You'll get me next time." And I nodded, and then Ed said, "And if you don't, you'll beat me at something else." I went to the porch and sipped iced tea with Edith. And Edith was reading this book, and she didn't put it down when she said, "That's not necessarily true, you know." I said, "How do you mean?" And that's when she put her book down and looked at me and said, "Life isn't fair, Bill. We tell our children that it is, but it's a terrible thing to do. It's not only a lie, it's a cruel lie. Life is not fair, and it never has been, and it's never going to be." Would you believe that for me, right then, it was like one of those comic books where the light bulb goes on over Mandrake the magician's head? "It isn't," I said so loudly, and I startled her. "You're right, it's not fair. I was so happy. If I'd known how to dance, I'd have started dancing. Isn't that great? Isn't it just terrific?" I think along about here, Edith must have thought I was well on my way toward being bonkers. But it meant so much to me to have it said, and out and free and flying. That was the discontent I endured the night my father stopped reading. I realized right then that was the reconciliation I was trying to make and couldn't. And that's what I think this book's about. All All those Columbia experts can spiel all they want about the delicious satire. They're crazy. This book says life isn't fair, and I'm telling you one and all, you better believe it. I got a fat, spoiled son. He's not going to nab Miss Rheingold, and he's always going to be fat. And if he gets skinny, he'll still be fat, and he'll still be spoiled, and life will never be enough to make him happy. And that's my fault, maybe. Maybe it's all my fault if you want. The point is, we're not created equal. For the rich, they sing, life isn't fair. I got a cold wife. She's brilliant. She's stimulating. She's terrific. There's no love. And that's okay. Just so long as we don't keep expecting everything to somehow even out for us before we die. Look, grown-ups, skip this paragraph. Grown-ups, turn off the live stream. Just joking, there's no grown-ups here. I'm not about to tell you this book has a tragic ending. I already said in the very first line how it was my favorite book in all the world, but there's a lot of bad stuff coming up. Torture, you've already been prepared for, but there's worse. There's death coming up, and you better understand this. Some of the wrong people die. Be ready for it. This isn't Curious George uses the potty. Nobody warned me, and it isn't my own fault. You'll see what I mean in a little, and that was my mistake. So I'm not letting it happen to you. The wrong people die, some of them. And the reason is this. Life is not fair. Forget all the garbage your parents put out. Remember Morgenstern. You'll be a lot happier. Okay, enough. Back to the next nightmare time. Okay, are we going to be able to continue?
I don't know, you ripped it up in there.
I was just reading what's in the page.
They usually just kill them just to get rid of them.
I was just reading.
Stop quoting Anne of Green Gables.
I was just reading what's on the page. Curious George uses the potty.
That's it. Everybody take a deep breath, please.
Oh my god.
All right. If I could put half of the humor into my book, I think I'd sell 100,000 copies. All right. I'm going to just continue now. The next night, she dreamt of giving birth to their first child, and it was a girl, a beautiful little girl. And Buttercup said, I'm sorry it wasn't a boy. I know how you need an heir. And Humperdinck said, Beloved, sweet, don't concern yourself with that. Just look at the glorious child God has given us. And then he left, and Buttercup held the child to her perfect breast. And the child said, Your milk is sour. And Buttercup said, Oh, I'm sorry. And she shifted to the other breast, and the child said, No, this is sour too. And Buttercup said, I don't know what to do. And the baby said, You always know what to do, and you always know exactly what to do. You always do exactly what's right for you, and the rest of the world can go hang. And Buttercup said, You mean Wesley. And the baby said, Of course I mean Wesley. And Buttercup explained patiently, I thought he was dead, you see. I'd given my word to your father, and the baby said, I'm dying now. There's no love in your milk. Your milk has killed me. And then the child stiffened and cracked and turned in Buttercup's hand to nothing but dry dust, and Buttercup screamed and screamed. Even when she was awake again, with 59 days to go till her marriage, she was still screaming. The third nightmare came quickly the following evening, and again it was the baby, this time a son, a marvelously strong son. And Humperdinck said, Beloved, it's a boy. And Buttercup said, I didn't fail you, thank heavens. And then he was gone, and Buttercup called out, May I see my son now? And all the doctors scurried around outside her royal room, and the boy was not brought in. What seems to be the trouble? Buttercup called out, and the chief doctor said, I don't quite understand, but he doesn't want to see you. And Buttercup said, Tell him I am his mother, and I am the queen, and I command his presence. And then he was there, just as handsome a baby boy as anyone could wish for. Close it, Buttercup said, and the doctors closed the door. The baby stood in the corner as far from her bed as he could. Come here, darling, Buttercup said. Why, are you going to kill me too? I am your mother, and I love you. Now come here, I've never killed anybody. You killed Wesley. Did you see his face in the fire swamp? When you walked off away and left him, that's what I call killing. When you're older, you'll understand things. Now that I'm going to tell you again, come here. Now I'm not going to tell you again. Come here. Murderer! The baby shouted. Murderer! But by then she was out of bed, and she had him in her arms and was saying, Stop that! Stop it this instant! I love you! And he said, Your love is poison. It kills. And he died in her arms, and she started to cry. Even when she was awake again, with 58 to go till her marriage, she was still crying. Okay, these nightmares aren't actually that funny. Just so you know. All right. The next night, she simply refused to go to sleep. Instead, she walked and read and did needlework and drank cup after cup of steaming tea from the Indies. She felt sick with weariness, of course, but such was her fear of what she might dream that she preferred any waking discomfort to whatever sleep might have to offer. And at dawn, her mother was pregnant. No, more than pregnant. Her mother was having a baby, and as Buttercup stood there in the corner of the room, she watched herself being born, and her father gasped at her beauty, and so did her mother, and the midwife was the first to show concern. The midwife was a sweet woman, known throughout the village for her love of babies, and she said, Look, trouble! And the father said, What trouble? Where before did you see ever such beauty? Did you ever see such beauty? And the midwife said, Don't you understand why she was given such beauty? It's because she has no heart. Here, listen. The baby is alive, but there is no beat. And she held Buttercup's chest against the father's ear, and the father could only nod and say, We must find a miracle man to place a heart inside. But the midwife said, That would be wrong, I think. I've heard before of creatures like this, the heartless ones. As they grow bigger, they get more and more beautiful, and behind them is nothing but broken bodies and shattered souls, and these without hearts are anguish bringers. And my advice would be, since you're both still young, to have another child, a different child, and be rid of this one now. But, of course, the final decision is up to you. And the father said to the mother, Well? And the mother said, Since the midwife is the kindest person in the village, she must know a monster when she sees one. Let's get to it. So Buttercup's father and Buttercup's mother put their hands to the baby's throat, and the baby began to gasp. Even when Buttercup was awake again at dawn, with 57 days to go till her marriage, she could not stop gasping. From then on, the nightmares became simply too frightening. When there were 50 days to go, Buttercup knocked one night on the door to Prince Humperdinck's chamber. She entered when he bid her to. I see trouble, he said. You look very ill. And so she did. Beautiful, of course, still that, but in no way well. Buttercup did not see quite how to begin. He ushered her into a chair. He got her water. She sipped at it, staring dead ahead. Excuse me. He put the glass to one side. At your convenience, princess, he said. It comes to this, Buttercup began. In the fire swamp, I made the worst mistake in all the world. I love Wesley. I always have. It seems I always will. I did not know this when you came to me. Please believe what I am about to say. When you said that I must marry you or face death, I answered, kill me. I meant that. I mean this now, too. If you say I must marry you in 50 days, I will be dead by morning. The prince was literally stunned. After a long moment, he knelt by Buttercup's chair and, in his gentlest voice, started to speak. I admit that when we first became engaged, there was to be no love involved. That was as much my choice as yours, though the notion may have come from you. But surely you must have noticed in this last month of parties and festivities a certain warming of my attitude. I have. You have been both sweet and noble. Thank you. Having said that, I hope you appreciate how difficult this next sentence is for me to say. I would die myself rather than cause your unhappiness by standing in the way of your marrying the man you love. Buttercup wanted almost to weep with gratitude. She said, I will bless you all my days for your kindness. Then she stood. So it's settled. Our wedding is off? He stood too. Except for perhaps one thing. That being, have you considered the possibility that he might not now want any longer to marry you? Until that moment she had not. You were, I hate to remind you, not altogether gentle with his emotions in the fire swamp. Forgive me for saying that, beloved, but you did leave him in the lurch, in a manner of speaking. Buttercup sat down hard, her turn now to be stunned. Humperdinck knelt again beside her. "This Wesley of yours, this sailor boy, has pride?" Buttercup managed to whisper. "More than any man alive, I sometimes think." "Well, consider then, dearest. Here he is, off sailing somewhere with the dread pirate Roberts. He has had a month to survive the emotional scars you dealt him. What if he wants now to remain single? Or worse, what if he has found another?" Buttercup was now even beyond whispering. "I think, sweetest child, that we should strike a bargain, you and I. If Wesley wants to marry you still, bless you both. If, for reasons unpleasant to mention, his pride will not let him, then you will marry me as planned, and be the Queen of Florin." "He couldn't be married, I'm sure, not my Wesley." She looked at the prince. "But how can I find out?" "What about this? You write him a letter, telling him everything. We'll make 4 copies. I'll take my 4 fastest ships and order them off in all directions. The dread pirate Roberts is not so often more than a month's sail from Florin. Whichever of my ships finds him will run the white flag of truce, deliver your letter, and Wesley can decide. If no, he can speak that message to my captain. If yes, my captain will sail him here to you, and I will have to content myself somehow with a lesser bride." I'm not sure, but I definitely think that this is the most generous decision I've yet heard. Do me this favor, then, in return. Until we know Wesley's intentions, one way or another, let us continue as we have, so the festivities will not be halted. And if I seem too fond of you, remember that I cannot help myself." "Agreed," Buttercup said, going to the door, but not before she kissed his cheek. He followed her. "Off with you now, and write your letter," and he returned the kiss, smiling with his eyes at her until the corridor curved her from his sight. There was no doubt whatsoever in his mind that he was going to seem too fond of her in the days ahead, because when she died of murder on their wedding night, it was crucial that all Florin realize the depth of his love, the epical size of his loss. Since then, no one would dare hesitate to follow him in the revenge war he was to launch against Gilder. At first, when he hired the Sicilian, he was convinced it was best that someone else do her in, all the while making it appear the work of soldiers from Gilder. And when the man in black had somehow materialized to spoil his plans, the prince came close to going insane with rage. But now his basically optimistic nature had reasserted itself. Everything always worked out for the best. The people were infatuated with Buttercup now as they had never been before her kidnapping, and when he announced from his castle balcony that she had been murdered, he already saw the scene in his mind. He would arrive just too late to save her from strangling, but soon enough to see the Gilderian soldiers leaping from the window of his bedroom to the soft ground below, when he made the speech to the masses on the 500th anniversary of his country. Well, there wouldn't be a dry eye in the square, and although he was just the least bit perturbed, since he had never actually killed a woman before with his bare hands, there was a first time for everything. Besides, if you wanted something done right, you did it yourself. That night they began to torture Wesley. Count Rugen did the actual pain-inducing. The prince simply sat by, asking questions out loud, inwardly admiring the count's skill. The count really cared about pain. The whys behind the screams interested him fully as much as the anguish itself. And whereas the prince spent his life in physically following the hunt, Count Rugen read and studied anything he could get his hands on, dealing with the subject of distress. "All right now," the prince said to Wesley, who lay in the great 5th-level cage. "Before we begin, I want you to answer me this. Have you any complaints about your treatment thus far?" "None whatever," Wesley replied, and in truth he had none. Oh, he might have preferred being unchained a bit now and then, but if you were to be a captive, you couldn't ask for more than had been given. The albino's medical ministrations had been precise, and his shoulder was fine again. The food the albino brought had always been hot and nourishing, the wine and brandy wonderfully warming against the darkness of the underground cage. "You feel fit, then?" the prince went on. "I assume my legs are a little stiff from being chained, but other than that, yes. Good. Then I promise you this, as God himself is my witness. Answer the next question, and I will set you free this night. But you must answer it honestly, fully, without withholding nothing. If you lie, I will know, and then I'll loose the count on you." "I have nothing to hide," Wesley said. "Ask away." "Who hired you to kidnap the princess?" "It was someone from Gilder. We found fabric indicating as much on the princess' horse. Tell me that man's name, and you are free. Speak." "No one hired me," Wesley said. "I was working strictly freelance, and I didn't kidnap her. I saved her from others who were doing that very thing. You seem a reasonable fellow, and my princess claims to have known you for many years, so I will give you on her account one last and final chance. The name of the man in Gilder, who hired you." "Gilder?" Okay, sorry.
Sounds like killed her.
Yeah. The name of the man in Gilder who hired you. I just thought of that, and I wonder if that is a coincidence. Gilder. "Tell me, or face torture." "No one hired me, I swear." The Count set fire to Wesley's hands. Nothing permanent or disabling. He just dipped Wesley's hands in oil and brought a candle close enough to set things bubbling. When Wesley had screamed, "No one, no one, no one, on my life!" a sufficient number of times, the Count dipped Wesley's hand in water, and he and the prince left via the underground entrance, leaving the medication to the albino, who was always nearby during the torturing times, but never visible enough to be distracting. "I feel quite invigorated," the Count said, as he and the prince began to ascend the underground staircase. "It's a perfect question. He was telling the truth clearly. We both know that." The prince nodded. The Count was privy to all his innermost plans for the revenge war. "I'm fascinated to see what happens," the Count went on. "Which pain will be least endurable, the physical or the mental anguish of having freedom offered if the truth is told, then telling it and being thought a liar?" "I think the physical," said the prince. "I think you're wrong," said the Count. Actually, they were both wrong. Wesley suffered not at all throughout. His screaming was totally a performance to please them. He had been practicing his defenses for a month now, and he was more than ready. The minute the Count brought the candle close, Wesley raised his eyes to the ceiling, dropped his eyelids over them, and in a state of deep and steady concentration, he took his brain away. Buttercup was what he thought of, her autumn hair, her perfect skin, and he brought her very close beside him, and had her whisper in his ear throughout the burning, "I love you, I love you. I only left you in the fire swamp to test your love for me. Is it as great as mine for you? Can two such loves exist on one planet at one time? Is there that much room, beloved Wesley?" The albino bandaged his fingers. Wesley lay still. For the first time the albino started things. Whispered, "You better tell them." From Wesley, a shrug. Whispered, "They never stop. Once they start, tell them what they want to know, and have done with it." Shrug. Whispered, "The machine is nearly ready. They are testing it on animals now." Shrug. Whispered, "It's for your own good I tell you these things." "My own good? What good? They're going to kill me anyway." From the albino, nod. The prince found Buttercup waiting unhappily outside his chamber doors. "It's my letter," she began. "I cannot make it right." Come in, the prince said gently. "Maybe we can help you." She sat down in the same chair as before. "All right, I'll close my eyes and listen. Read to me." "Wesley, my passion, my sweet, my only, my own, come back, come back. I shall kill myself otherwise. Yours in torment, Buttercup." She looked at Humperdinck. "Well, do you think I'm throwing myself at him?" It does seem a bit forward, the prince admitted. It doesn't leave him a great deal of room to maneuver. Will you help me to improve it, please? I'll do what I can, sweet lady, but first it might help if I knew just a bit about him. Is he really so wonderful, this Wesley of yours? Not so much wonderful as perfect, she replied. Kind of flawless, more or less magnificent, without blemish, rather on the ideal side. She looked at the prince. Am I being helpful? I think emotions are clouding your objectivity just a bit. Do you actually think there is nothing the fellow can't do? Buttercup thought for a while. It's not so much that there's nothing he can't do, it's more that he can do it all better than anybody else can do it. The prince chuckled and smiled. In other words, for example, you mean if he wanted to hunt, he could out-hunt again, for example, someone such as myself. Oh, I would think as if he wanted to, he could quite easily, but he happens not to like hunting, at least not to my knowledge. Though maybe he does, I don't know. I never knew he was so interested in mountain climbing, but he scaled the cliffs of insanity under most adverse conditions, and everyone agrees that that is not the easiest thing in the world to accomplish. Well, why don't we just begin our letter with Divine Wesley, and appeal to his sense of modesty, the prince suggested. Buttercup began to write, stopped. Does divine begin with D-E or D-I? D-I, I believe, amazing creature, the prince replied, smiling gently as Buttercup commenced the letter, then composed it in 4 hours, and many times she said, I could never get through this without you, and the prince was always most modest, asking little helpful personal questions about Wesley as often as was possible, without drawing attention to it, and in this way, well before dawn, she told him, smiling as she remembered of Wesley's early fears of spinning ticks. And that night, in the 5th level cage, the prince asked, as he was to always ask, Tell me the name of the man in Gilder who hired you to kidnap the princess, and I promise you immediate freedom. And Wesley replied, as he always was to reply, No one, I was alone, and the count, who had spent the day getting the spinners ready, placed them carefully on Wesley's skin, and Wesley closed his eyes and begged and pleaded, and after an hour or so, the prince and the count left, the albino remaining behind with the chore of burning the spinners and then pulling them free from Wesley, lest they accidentally poison him. And on the way up the underground stairs to ground level, the prince said, just for conversation's sake, Much better, don't you think? The count oddly said nothing, which was vaguely irritating to Humperdinck, because, to tell the absolute truth, torture was never all that high on his scale of passions, and he would just as soon have disposed of Wesley right then. If only Buttercup would admit that he, Humperdinck, was the better man, but she would not. She simply would not, and all she ever talked about was Wesley. All she ever asked about was news of Wesley. Days went by, weeks went by, party after party went by, and all Florin was moved by the spectacle of their great hunting prince, at last so clearly and wonderfully in love. But when they were alone, all she ever said was, I wonder where Wesley could be. What could be taking him so long? How can I live until he comes? Maddening. So each night the count's discomforts, which made Wesley writhe and twist, were really sort of all right. The prince would manage an hour or so of spectating before he and the count would leave, the count still oddly silent, and down below, tending the wounds, the albino would whisper, Tell them, please! They will only add to your suffering. Wesley could barely suppress his smile. He had felt no pain, not once, none. He had closed his eyes and taken his brain away. That was the secret. If you could take your brain away from the present and send it to where it could contemplate skin like wintry cream, well, let them enjoy themselves. His revenge time would come. Wesley was living now most of all for Buttercup, but there was no denying that there was one more thing he wanted to do. He wanted his time. And that, I think, is probably as good a place as any to stop it for the day.
Is that the end of the chapter?
No, it's not. No, we've got
A lot more pages.
a lot more pages. About 30 more pages left in this chapter.
Oh my
So,
gosh.
yeah. So I am
halfway.
going to put my bookmark right there.
Right there.
But like I said, I think we have 3 more days of reading to do, which we will do one on Tuesday, not one on Wednesday. Tomorrow, first thing.
What?
One on Tuesday, which is tomorrow, probably one on Thursday. Thursday's the 18th. And either Friday or Saturday, Mom's choice. Maybe we finish it on Mom's birthday. Maybe we finish it a day later. All right, so we appreciate you. We appreciate you. Yes, we do. I don't know the rest of the words. All right, I will bid you adieu. And I hope that you have a super spectacular day. And nope, we're going to do that first thing. That's going to be a first thing. The art gallery will be featured first thing on tomorrow's live stream. All right.
Stuff to show.
JJ. All right. Good night.